Hello, my HS 103 students. This is your Professor Donald Earl Collins. It is now week 11. Hello. Welcome to the week. This week and next week are basically the end of formal lectures for the course. 3 or 4 lectures plus discussion leading us to basically our present time. This week we'll cover the end of the Cold War, the start of the post-Cold War era, and U.S. international economics and politics and cultural transformations, both around the world in terms of globalization, terrorism, climate change, eventually the pandemic, economic turmoil, and so on. And at home as well, at home in the U.S., post-Cold War era of 1990s austerity, of eventually compassionate conservatism, which was not very compassionate, and in some cases not very conservative. The war on terror, Hurricane Katrina, and a million other things that sort of add up to where we are today. Really, the times of the growing up years for the bulk of millennials or Gen Yers, and for quite frankly your generation, the older folks of your generation. Some people in this election of 2022 have claimed to be um, Gen Zers because they were born sometime, I guess, in 1997. But according to my facts, a Gen Zer is born about in the 98, beginning of 99 on. Technically, they're really millennials, like the youngest of millennials. So I'm not sure if there's been anybody under the age of 25 elected or 24 elected to be in any national office yet as a congressperson. We'll see. I don't know. We'll find out in the next couple of months who is a Gen Z and who's a Gen Y, or your generations can argue about that. Anyway, I don't have anything new to add in terms of assignments. You know what your projects are at this point. Everybody's either picked a project, had a project accepted. I think there may be 4 people who have not come back to me to revise what they already have, or to let me know what they've turned their things into. If you don't, there will be points taken off. I'm not talking about the difference between A or B or B or C, but you will lose some points. I mean, the whole point of this is so that you have a clear sense of what it is you're supposed to be doing and why. And yeah, I have a clear sense of what you're doing so that when you're presenting, you're not presenting something that's basically a middle school or high school book report. So there's that aspect of things that I want to make sure that people are aware of. I still have office hours this week. We are meeting virtually this Thursday, the 17th of November. So there's that. And after that is we're off the entirety of Thanksgiving week because I've canceled class on the 22nd of November, which would normally be a class day. But I never saw the point. I have never seen the point of meeting the Tuesday, 2 days before Thanksgiving, where basically maybe a third of students show up. I've had as few as a quarter of students show up for classes before, across the board for classes. The day before campus is basically shut down for a better part of a week. So there's that. So let me just go through very quickly the things that we're going to talk about over the course of the week. It breaks down really into 2 things. It's a continuing thing from last week, which is that everything that the U.S. does internally, domestically, has an impact on its relationships outside the United States. And everything that the U.S. does externally in terms of its geopolitics, military interventions, international economic cooperation or not lack of cooperation, America first among equals, America first in terms of isolationism, however you, it has incredible amount of impact at home as well. We've already talked about that regarding Vietnam, the OPEC oil crisis and the embargoes, economic stagflation and its impact on the U.S. and the world as a whole, international competition, multinational corporations, deindustrialization, suburbanization, the movement of jobs to the Sun Belt and the movement of jobs by the 1980s, the beginning of the movement of jobs even overseas. All of that has an impact on the U.S. that we now know of today. The bottom line is Pax Americana, or at least the height of America as a superpower, both at home and internationally, pretty much ended with Vietnam in 1973. And while the Reagan years were meant to recapture that, um, with the merging of religious conservatism and secular conservatism or mainstream conservatism in the 1980s, it does to some extent recapture the economy. Comes roaring back a bit in the second half of the 1980s, but it's a different economy from the economy that existed before. It's less dependent on and the needs of the industrial world, the needs of folks in general to work manufacturing jobs, and it's more dependent on service industries, white collar work, multinational corporations, and the shift of business to basically being the business of America being the business of the world. That is to say that wherever American corporations plant their flag in order to find workers to do industrial work is where their work is taking place. And some of that money comes back to the U.S. in form of profits. Some of it gets sent offshore. All of that. You start to see the development of two Americas. And mind you, there already are two Americas, one white, one black, separate and inherently unequal according to the Kerner Commission report of 1968. But there's another two Americas, this one between the haves and the have-nots, or as George W. Bush put it in 2005 or 6, the have-mores, right? Which was supposed to be a joke during his White House Correspondents' Dinner, but it's not much of a joke if you're the multimillionaire or near billionaire telling the joke in the case of the Bush family. And there are 150 million people who, don't even have the equivalent of a living wage without working 2 and 3 jobs. So it's not much of a joke, but you start seeing this separation in the 1980s at home around these sorts of things, and it gets worse it gets worse during the early 90s when a recession hits in the early 90s that basically impacts disproportionately white collar workers, but also has an impact on the working class. Shifting ever more people out of manufacturing jobs and ever more people into service industry work, which is typically low wage, provides very few benefits, generally speaking is non-union or harsh to unions or really anti-union as the case may be. The Walmarts, for example, one of the largest employers, if not the largest employer in the United States, would be one example of that. Certainly, other startups like Target would be another example of that, and so on. So when you start thinking about where the country is economically in terms of the average wage of workers and so on and so forth, there's with all the up cycles and the down cycles and everything in between. You can't point to a year where the U.S. gets back to exactly where it was in 1973. Sometimes it approaches it, and then the tax cuts come along, and then nope, doesn't quite get there, right? You can point to the 1990s and the internet boom and the tech boom of the 1990s that led to the creation of Amazon and Walmart. I mean, not Walmart, excuse me, Amazon and Google and Yahoo and the rise of Microsoft and Bill Gates is the richest man in the world and Warren Buffett. But look at what they're doing. They're providing services, technological services. They're not creating new technologies. Internet is a technology that's based on work that was done by the DoD and by scientists in the late 60s and early 70s to link computers, to link networks across across sectors, across departments, across the country, and all over the world. It led to what we have now: email, the internet, social media, all the things that's based on that work, based on the work of what used to be computer science work, the serious work of building code, out of Pascal and COBOL and assembly language and Fortran and all these other languages, what we now consider the marvel of the modern world, our information age. But they're building services on the basis of that, right? The internet itself is free. It's still free, even with all the shenanigans of Congress. Internet itself is free. The services that you get through it are the ones that we're paying for. You are directly interacting through advertising, through other services. And that includes things like Google, everything that Google provides. It includes Linux, it includes Mac OS, it includes your iPhone, includes all of that stuff. And one of the questions I like asking students when it comes to this information age, this age of great technologies, considering everything the marvel of this age, and you go to yourself, but is there anything really new and innovative that has come out in the last 50 years that has fundamentally changed the way we live our lives? And what I mean by live our lives is all of a sudden we can now replicate food out of thin air using, matter, energy transferring machines. We're able to not grow our food through agriculture anymore. We have figured out a way out of climate change that doesn't, that gets all of these greenhouse gases, methane, carbon dioxide, sulfuric dioxide, all this stuff out of the air, and so we can stave off the extinction potentially of 30% of all species on the planet within the next century as a result. We have the ability to have controlled nuclear fusion and clean energy that's free for everybody. No, none of those things have happened. You can talk about your iPhone, you can talk about Android technology, you can talk about social media, the ability to instantaneously share gigabytes worth of information at a time. You can talk about all of that stuff. But when we're no closer to doing mission to Mars now than we were when we were going to the moon every 5 or 6 months between 1969 and 1972, that doesn't really bode well for the future in terms of science and technology and innovation. Matter of fact, we're still dealing with many of the same issues that we were dealing with 50 years ago and 100 years ago. Reproductive rights, the rights of people of color in the United States, the rights of people of color around the world and throughout the global South. Um, the the largesse and the corruption of rich countries around the world to the denigration and degradation of the environment and denigration of peoples who are not in Europe, Japan, the United States, and Canada over the course of the last 50 or 100 years. We're still dealing with these mindsets around eugenics and colonization and white supremacy and misogyny, misogynoir, and transphobia and homophobia and elitism and classism. We're still dealing with that. We're still dealing with fascist forces rising up in the midst of a pandemic. So when we talk about all of these things around what's changed internationally, the biggest difference between where we were at the end of the Cold War and where we are now is that instead of having one enemy, right, or one set of enemies, communist countries, anyone that basically doesn't adhere toward an American style democracy is potentially an enemy. Even during 9/11, in the post 9/11 world, for 4 years, people were calling French fries, some people, I should say anyway, freedom fries. And the reason they called them freedom fries is simply because of the fact that France refused to support U.S. engagements in Afghanistan and particularly Iraq in the period after 2001 and 2003. And those interventions were supposed to be about catching and killing Osama bin Laden, the people who planned the 9/11 attacks on the U.S. on Tuesday, September 11th, 2001. But in point of fact, those turned into big-time military-industrial contracts, which put a lot of young Americans, a lot of brave Americans who otherwise thought they were fighting for country and freedom and democracy, not just in the United States, but around the world, in harm's way. Ultimately, Afghanistan returned to its pre-2001 condition controlled by the Taliban. We abandoned, commitments to folks who helped us catch Osama bin Laden and helped the U.S. catch other, something like 2,500, 3,000 terrorists over the course of 2 decades. We abandoned those efforts, and spent trillions of dollars in the process of doing so. Same thing with Iraq is even worse. Going over to Iraq for the purposes of, supposedly finding weapons of mass destruction that never existed, that the Bush administration, the W administration knew did not exist. This is not conjecture. There's full blown on evidence done by researchers, done by experts, done by journalists, done by investigative reporters who have all come to the same conclusion. If this weren't the United States of America, George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, the late Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, and a host of others, Ashcroft and a whole host of others involved in this, would have all stood for war crimes. We bombed a modern country essentially, back into an age where it had to rebuild itself. It's still unstable compared to where it was under Saddam Hussein. You can argue with me you want about his totalitarian regime, his ruling it as sort of an Eastern warlord type. But you know what? We've got a 50 or 100, 50 to 100 countries that have faced that situation over the years. Why Iraq? Why not Iran? Why not, Rwanda, where the U.S. basically turned a blind eye to what was happening in Rwanda and let 800,000 people die in a span of 6 months, because the Hutu and the Tutsi couldn't get along, and all that these colonization types of things that were in the mindset of the people who lived there erupted in the full-blown civil war and led to the deaths and ethnic cleansing of nearly an entire group, over the course of 6 months. But we didn't do anything about that. The U.S. didn't do anything about that. But we were involved in Somalia, and that led to the famous incident known as Black Hawk Down in October of 1993, and that eventually led to the movie Black Hawk Down in 2002. So we never really got the peace dividend that George Herbert Walker Bush 41 talked about in 1991 and 92. Yes, for a little bit of time, the U.S. military spending went down during his last couple of years in office after the Gulf War in 91 and before the end of the 90s. But it started creeping back up again in 98, and it hasn't come down since. And so, with the with 800 billion trillion dollars or so, trillions of dollars worth of spending that have been off the books in the $500 billion to $800 billion a year we've been spending on the military over the last 20 years. The real question becomes, what does this future look like? We're a more militarized country now than we were 20 or 30 years ago. Maybe so than 40 years ago during the last years of the Cold War. So where are we? Right? That's one set of questions. But domestically, when you combine things that have happened particularly in the period between the late 80s and Obama's time in office, late 2000s, 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010, the Obama years, right? These are the years supposedly where the country has turned the corner, has become post-racial. Only thing that happened, though, is that the rise of the Tea Party happened with Obama's election. And with Obama's election in 2008, the rise of a more conservative extreme, accusing him of all kinds of things that actually have no basis in fact. Obama apparently is the Kenyan socialist communist tyrant that wants to have big government and basically wants everybody to give up being rich, while simultaneously he's anti-white, even though he's biracial and all this other stuff. I mean, there's just this whole mix of goofiness in this period. But I do also think, and most historians also think, that because the U.S. commits itself to sort of a neoliberal style of politics, particularly during the Clinton years, one that is pro-business, holds the line on terms of social welfare programs, the social welfare cuts that happened under Reagan are never fully made up during either Bush years, and certainly during the time of Clinton's office. Clinton is the one working with Newt Gingrich and the people who declared a contract with America, what we Gen Xers called in 1994 the Contract on America, and essentially making welfare a work program. as if the people who are on welfare have never worked a job before, because their assumption was because these folks have lived in, some of these folks have lived with generational poverty, that meant that they lived on welfare generation after generation, when in point of fact only 5% of all welfare recipients have had this be truly a generational issue, meaning that they were on welfare all the time that they were growing up, ended up having a kid, and then they themselves ended up on welfare. That's not how it typically works. People find themselves on welfare for a million different reasons. Or so you might have worked for 10, 20, 25 years. You lose a job. You don't, you lose a job you're counting on. You've been living hand to mouth anyway. All of a sudden, you need welfare so that you're not homeless, so that you and your 3 kids or 2 kids or 1 kid is taken care of for a few years. And then that kid grows up and deals with these issues or cycles of boom or bust within the economy. And then they themselves might end up on welfare at one point in time or another because they might have a kid or two that they're trying to take care of. It happens. It's called life, but let's blame it on sort of cultural degenerativeness among poor African Americans, particularly women who are of a certain age, having kids before their age of 20, kind of thing, as if this is some sort of epidemic. And that's the way a lot of things in government gets treated in this period, not just with welfare. And with the rise of TANF in 1996, this Welfare to Work project, which replaced AFDC, right? It's the same thing with the war on drugs. Let's blame individuals for their addictions rather than a system that helped pour drugs on the street. The CIA admits, because of its Iran-Contra things, there's a whole series on FX called Snowfall that specifically deals with how crack cocaine arrives in the United States, specifically on the West Coast first, and it eventually makes its way east during the mid 1980s. And it's the CIA that's bringing this stuff and the technology to make this stuff to the West Coast. They're the ones that are ultimately responsible for pouring drugs into depressed communities. But instead of dealing with the issue the same way we've been trying to deal with the opioid epidemic of Oxycontin and then heroin and now fentanyl, and the combination of all of these with cocaine and crystal meth in predominantly poor white communities, rural white communities, Rust Belt communities that are, whether urban or rural across the country, we've treated predominantly Black and Latinx communities as if they're the enemy, as if they're enemy combatants in the war. Is these people we're supposed to feel sorry for because they're killing themselves with drugs every day, which I call BS on. Ultimately, that's just a whole bunch of BS. And so you'll see through a couple of films I'll show this week the two sides of the U.S. The external side on the international front. This U.S. the triumph of winning the Cold War, but maybe losing the peace around the world long term, because instead of having one enemy, one set of values, we see pretty much any number of folks who are not adherents to the American way as potentially being enemies. Particularly those who are not Christian, particularly those who aren't white and not Christian, right? Even France could be the enemy, and we can say freedom fries for 4 years, and darn well that if you're talking about Osama bin Laden and 9/11, or anybody who might have an inkling of an axe to grind against the U.S. because of U.S. interventions in the past, as being the enemy. And on the domestic front, you've also got this issue of treating citizens as enemies, whether they be Arab Muslim, Arab Christian, Sikh, African American, women, white, black, indigenous, etc., Latinx folk who, particularly Latinx folk who aren't conservatives, right? This is not about a 50-50 split in the U.S. This is about ultimately those in power pushing things further and further to the right, to where the left really is anything that isn't fascist or leaning fascist. So if you're a moderate, the typical white moderate that's always existed in this country, you're progressive by fascist standards, and therefore liberal, which is crazy use of wording that basically throws a true leftist, which is only 7% of the population really, and with 60-65% of the population that leans center, maybe even center right. So that's where we are. But I'll let you a little bit more about this week, along with where we are as a country, both economically and eventually politically, culturally, and otherwise when we get to the week after Thanksgiving. So that's it for this week.